I'm going to talk about Haifa and trying to make some national sensibility out of the local story of Haifa. And I'll start with the Israeli historiography, because the Israeli historiography, it is very customary to say the transition from Yishuv to statehood, meaning from mandatory period to the establishment of the state, was relatively smooth, thanks to the pre-state governmental system that the organized Jewish community in Palestine established. But reality, as always, was a little more complex, especially in the more complex places, which I like most because I think they're more interesting. Itamar, you might agree with me, the mixed cities. So the first point is connected to the Yishuv, or to the Hebrew leaders, which actually did not formulate an unequivocal position regarding the mixed cities during the whole mandatory time, and that reflected in the transition to statehood. Another matter stems from the fact that the Jews created in these places a dual system of local governmental establishment, both Jewish and municipal. The establishment of Israel necessitated institutionalization, that is, to merge this dual structure into one. And it was not only an organizational problem, because at the same time it was necessary to deal with the changes in consciousness, again, both governmental and public, from being a citizen of a mixed city under colonial rule to being part of a Jewish or a Hebrew city with large Arab minority. And that's a totally different approach toward the city. Let me start with a brief introduction about the mixed cities and the Zionist interest in them. The formal term of mixed cities, as some of you might know, is actually a British one. And they used it in 1937 when they began drawing the map of partition. But in fact, there were very few mixed cities in mandatory Palestine. In the north, there were Safed, there were Tiberias, which attracted Orthodox Jews, mainly by their definition as holy cities. Jerusalem was another holy city, but also a political and governmental center, so it attracted Zionist immigrants. There was Jaffa, which lost its definition as a mixed city due to the separation of Tel Aviv, despite the fact that 30,000 Jews lived in Jaffa in 1948. And there were Haifa, whom we're going to talk today. And there were significant communities in other Arab cities, such as Acre, Gaza, Hebron, but these communities ceased to exist until the mid-30s, and none of them, except Acre, actually never attracted Jewish European or Zionist immigrants. And none of them really managed to go from an Arab city with a minority of Jews to the term of a mixed city. So in other words, the Jewish Zionist community settled in Arab cities only if it had an interest in, either symbolic or economic or strategic. Generally, they preferred homogeneous Jewish settlement, preferably Hebrew, meaning national and new. One of the implications of this preference in the few existing mixed cities was the establishment of separate national system within the city, which was characterized by the population distribution, the creation of distinct cultural spaces, Hebrew separate neighborhoods, and the creation of a separate community structure with a distinct public leadership under the name of the Community Committee. And this leadership, the Community Committee, received legal status in 1928 from the British, from the mandatory government. That was the community order. These community committees was democratically elected. They were on a party basis. It included, as you can see, economic, welfare and health, education, religious community. So they were actually dealing with every aspect of daily life of the Jewish population within the city. Now, in Haifa had the strongest Jewish community institution that exists alongside a joint and, I should say, very functioning municipality. And both institutions continued their work even after a nomination of a Jewish mayor in 1940. This is Shabtai Levi, who I'm going to talk later. Now, this is very different from other community committees in the country, because in Jaffa, for example, the community committee ceased to exist because of Tel Aviv municipality. In Jerusalem, they had a community committee, but it was very low. It was very weak institution due to internal divisions within the Jewish population. So Haifa was really the exceptional. If we're looking for local Arab organization or parallel Arab organization, until the end of 1947, actually there was no such separate Arab national and local-based communities. And we have to understand that these kind of organizations are based on minority consciousness. They're based on the rights of an autonomous minority that had been planted since the Ottoman period under the Millet laws. So for the local Arabs, the municipality was actually the logical representative institution, and they did not need any parallel kind of institutions like Jewish established. That's changed just before the War of Independence, when Arab civic leaders began to form in the mixed cities committees that functioned as emergency committees. And also the Hebrew communities or the Jewish communities established from the community committee an emergency committee. So we have actually two parallel systems, national parallel system with the city, a very weak city institutions in between. So I'll take a close look over Haifa. Haifa was one of the three largest and most important cities in Palestine. It was the capital of the north, it was the military and the industrial center. On the eve of the war, we're talking about 130,000 people who lived in Haifa. And if you look at the numbers, you can see that the percentage of Jews grew. If we're talking about 1922, we're talking about 25% of Jews, while in 1948, we're talking about 66% of Jews. So that's tell you the story. And again, why Haifa? Because Haifa was economically developed city, and therefore it had a developing Jewish community. And it goes with what I said before, that new Zionists, new Jewish immigrants arrived to mixed cities if they had, if it was worthy for them. This heterogenic society, or the new community of Haifa, that was very heterogeneous, was comprised from veterans, mostly Sephardic. Some of them were Ashkenazi Orthodox, but the majority were new immigrants, mostly European Jews. But despite the diversity, it had a very solid organization structure. It had a workers' organization that had attained political hegemony by 1931. It had a very strong Burganian civilian population, and they were all organized in a voluntarily institutional system, again, parallel to the city. They established their own fire department, they established their own civil defense system, they established their own distinct legal system parallel to the government, parallel to the city, that is the Hebrew court that was very strong in Haifa. The process of segregation was also in the distribution of the population, and if you look at this table, you can see that in 1922, 95% of the Jews of Haifa lived downtown. Obviously, but these were the mixed areas, but by 1948, only 3% of the Jews of Haifa stayed downtown. So we cannot talk about downtown Haifa as a mixed area anymore. It was the Arab area. And all these percent of Jews, they were all Sephardic, they were all veterans, and they were all poor. So, and here you can see the new neighborhood established in Haifa up on the Mountain Carmel. So as I said, we are not talking only about spatial spaces, but also about culturally distinct. Especially since the 30s, the Jewish neighborhoods became more European, more national in their culture and landscape. And this is a picture from the beginning of the 40s from Central Hadar Carmel. This is a picture for downtown, the marketplace, city place. This is from the 20s. So you can see the difference in the landscape. But we're not talking about mixed cities. So of course there were cooperation and mutual influences between Jews and Arabs. Of course there were new Arab neighborhoods that had also modern construction, had European influence. There was even one Jewish architect who built quite a few buildings for the Arab Buganius, that's Moshe Oral. And there were business partnerships and common markets and mixed British working places, such as the ports, such as the railways. But if you look at the overall picture, then we can say that both communities grew and differed constantly. We cannot take for granted Jewish municipal partnership in the city. Since the British allowed municipal separation, or the definition of autonomous local council within the city, and again combined it with what I told you before, that Jewish people actually did not prefer to live in these communal spaces. They preferred homogeneous Hebrew neighborhoods. So being part of the city or staying part of the municipality was quite the question. In Haifa, staying part of the mixed city had to do with the topographical structures that you can see here, that kept the economic heart downtown, near the sea. It kept the British mixed and strategic workplaces downtown near the sea. At the same time, it had a huge implication for the veteran Jews who remained in the mixed neighborhoods but had organized community to lean on. And I want to say that this was not a choice of living with the Arabs, but it was rather a choice of maintaining Jewish interests in the city, because this was an important strategic place. This was especially evident in 1937 when Ben-Gurion announced plans for strengthening Hebrew Haifa, and he wanted to strengthen Hebrew Haifa. He wanted to strengthen the Hebrew community or the Hebrew interest in the city, looking forward to partition and then to the establishment of the state. According to this approach, the Jews saw the municipality as a coordinating framework and as a conduit for government funds, but for them, the internal institutions were more significant. And this was evident with the Jews' attitude toward the first Jewish mayor, Shabtai Levi, and I apologize that he's in colored and Hassan Shukri is in red with white. This is the pictures that I found. But when Hassan Shukri was appointed, when Shabtai Levi was appointed, he, like Hassan Shukri before him, made sure to present himself as the mayor of Haifa and not as the Jew representative. His appointment so only increased the duality in the attitude of the Jews toward the municipality and demanded creative solutions. One example that I'm going to give you is the establishment of a joint municipal education department in 1942. Now, the Jews in Haifa were against joining this kind of education department, and they agreed only after Shabtai Levi was nominated a mayor, because after they had a Jewish mayor. But the reason that they agreed was to receive the funds of the mandate government. But in practice, however, two separate departments, Jewish and Arabs, operated with no connection at all, under the same name, the same municipality, but with actually no connections at all. This complex and very delicate framework, when moving from Yishuv to statehood, arose three major questions. The first was the need to regulate relations with the Arabs of the city. The second was the need to adjust the relations between the community institutions and the municipality. And the third was the need to regulate relations between local institutions and state institutions. Everyone looked at Haifa. As an example, because the Battle of Haifa was in April 21st, 22nd, ended before the declaration of independence. Haifa became the first deliberate and conquered, you choose the word, mixed city. Another point that made regulation in Haifa important was that British developed the city as a strategic center, and they left behind the railway junction, the port, the airport, the refineries. It all stayed. So therefore, it made the city significant for the newly born state. So it was not a local municipal question, but it became a national one. From this perspective, transition from Yishuv to statehood, especially the transfer time, when the battle over the city ended but the new state was yet to be born, created an inner struggle. It was not only Jews against Arabs or Jews against the British, but also local institutions who had local interest in mind, sometimes against national leadership, who had national interest in front of them. Now, there is always a tension between local and national interests, but in Haifa, prior to the declaration of the state, meaning before the British left, it was times of shaping the new powers in the city and in the state. So that tension was crucial. And I give you only one example for that. It was the question of who is going to lead securing the workers at the mixed governmental still working workplaces. So the Haganah demanded exclusive responsibility, meaning national responsibility. But the local public leadership saw itself as local leaders, and they wanted to hold the reins. So we're talking about a debate here over hierarchy, but we must remember that it's not only hierarchy between local and national. It was also hierarchy within the labor movement that was in hegemonic power both in the national institutions and the local institutions. So it was very complicated. It wasn't only a question of hierarchy, though. It was also the question of how they saw the future of the city, in local eyes or in the national eyes. The questions, one question that arose great debate was the deserted Arab houses and property. This became a huge debate in the city because we're talking about 5,000 abandoned Arab apartments or apartments that the British have already boycotted up on Mount Carmel. Now the Haganah and from the IDF, they demanded these apartments for discharged soldiers and for officers. And again, local leadership wanted to conduct the situation. And at first, the local leaderships conducted a struggle to keep the Arab property until the Arab will come back. It was obvious for them that the Arabs are going to come back. But then, a few weeks later, when it was obvious that the Arabs did not come back or are not coming back, an inner tense arose among the local Jewish population and the local Jewish leaders about the future of the city. And we have to understand that for them, it was the day after the battles ended. And they were thinking about how the city is going to be. And questions like, is it going to remain a mixed city, or are we going to take advantage of reality and leave the city as a Jewish one? Question about how to treat the remaining Arabs. Questions about the abandoned property. Local leaders, for example, they tried to prevent the establishment of a military government in the lower city. They really fought for that. But again, if they saw, if for the local leadership it was the day after, for the national leadership it was the day before, because we were just in the beginning of the war. So it is really totally two different points of views. If we're looking at the same issue that continued after the British left, but from a different angle, Haifa became the main immigration port to Israel. So Haifa leaders wanted to house local refugees whose home had been demolished during the fights, or new immigrants who would remain in the city and not pass through it. The government again preferred to house army officers. In July 1948, that debate stopped. And it stopped because the new government took over running these kind of things, like abandoned properties, like how to treat the Arabs, not locally, but nationally. And I think that the government took all control over things, not that just because they wanted to take care of things, but just, I'll give you the numbers and you'll understand why. Because by July, 3,600 out of these 5,000 apartments were already resulted. 2,400 by new immigrants, meaning according to the local leaders' wishes. 700 were given to refugees and only 400 to soldiers. So the government realized that they had to make a move. Another example, and this is the last example I want to show you, is the British port. According to the partition decision, the port was to be part of the Jewish state, but it would also was to provide services to the both states, to the Arab state who was supposed to be established. Now, the British were to evacuate the port in the middle of June 1948. They decided to transfer the port to the city of Haifa in early May. It was only until the legal government was to be established in Israel because the British did not accept the provisional government. So Haifa municipality, they knew they had only a few weeks to establish their force or to establish their hold on the port. And what Shabtai Levi did is that he appointed a committee, a local municipal committee for the port, and he appointed to this committee Tahir Karaman, who was a Christian Arab from the city's dignitaries who remained in the city. And he was like to clarify the local interest of the mixed municipality. But again, the state of Israel was in the middle of a war over its life, and the port combined a military port and a civilian port. So we can only imagine what Levi's moved, how it arose great resentment. And again, it was not only the national idea of an Arab being part of a committee running the port during wartime. No, it was also about economic, great debate. Because when we're looking at the port, we're looking at economic interests resulting from the ownership of the port, surrounding land, commerce area, etc., that previously they belonged to the British. So the question whether the port would become a local port or a national one was of cardinal economic question. And the government had no intention to give it to the city. And despite local great efforts, the government transferred the port to Israel by July 22nd, 1948. So this was just few examples of the complexity of transition of a mixed city during the war for independence between Yishuv society and statehood, and questions of urban local nature, such as the future of relations with local Arabs, such as the issue of municipality authority over the city assets. They were all, in fact, questions of national character that determined the nature of the young state, and let me say the very centralist nature of the young state for years to come. Thanks.
In a recent important book, historian Dmitry Shumsky argues that the forefathers of Zionism did not always favor the nation-state model. Herzl, Jabotinsky, Weizmann, and Ben-Gurion grew up in multi-ethnic empires and were sympathetic to attempts by minorities to gain national autonomy within the imperial structure. Even after the First World War, Zionist leaders participated in the fight to ensure national rights for Eastern European Jews. The Zionist leadership, argues Shumsky, could not justify its fight for Jewish national autonomy in Europe while depriving the same right from the Palestinian Arabs. According to Shumsky, only during the Holocaust, which rendered the continuation of Jewish life in Europe impossible, did Ben-Gurion switch to the nation-state model. Shumsky's argument is groundbreaking in many ways, but lacking in others. Most importantly, Shumsky foregrounds Eastern and Central European thought while sidelining both international politics and the situation in Palestine. I, on the other hand, would like to show how the question of demography, and especially Jewish immigration to Palestine, has shaped the Zionist political imagination during the Mandate years. In terms of Zionist political thought, we can divide the Mandate years into two periods. The first one, from 1917 until roughly 1937, was characterized by the mutual non-domination principle, which posited that Jews should not dominate Arabs and vice versa. Keenly aware of the small size of the Jewish population of Palestine, virtually every major Zionist politician supported some sort of democratic solution that would work around majority rule. From 1937 until 1948, the Zionist leaders sought to create a Jewish nation-state in all of or in parts of Palestine. Why did this change occur? In the mid-1930s, it became clear to the Zionist leadership that Palestine was the only country that could absorb the many Jews who wished to escape Europe. Once it was clear that the British would not allow for mass Jewish immigration to Palestine, Ben-Gurion shifted to the nation-state model. He did so because the nation-state model was the only political system that ensured Jewish control of immigration. Indeed, the need to control immigration lies at the heart of Ben-Gurion's acceptance of partition. In other words, the Zionists' turn to the nation-state was not an ideological change of heart. It was a pragmatic solution to the plight of European Jews. The mutual non-domination principle was inspired by late Habsburgian autonomist thought. Habsburgian thinkers sought to create extensive national autonomies without breaking up the imperial structure. In Mandate Palestine, however, the mutual non-domination principle had a slightly different function. The Mandate Charter charged Britain with establishing self-governing institutions in Palestine. Given the fact that in 1917 Jews amounted to only 10% of the population, any majoritarian institution would have been harmful to the Zionist project. In order to prevent the political representation of the Arab majority, the Zionist leaders cleaved to the idea that Jews and Arabs should not dominate each other. The mutual non-domination principle had three potential applications corresponding to three levels of sovereignty. At the most basic level, it could mean the creation of two extensive national autonomies under British rule. Alternatively, it could mean complete parity between Jews and Arabs in a Palestinian legislature. This would mean that the British would have to share some power with the locals. Finally, it could mean a joint Jewish-Arab parliament that controlled the Federation of National Autonomies. This formulation suggested an independent Palestinian state. Of course, both the Arabs and the British rejected, at least officially, the mutual non-domination principle. But the immediate purpose of the mutual non-domination principle was not to win over the Arabs or the British, but to prevent the establishment of the Legislative Council. The Legislative Council would have been a joint Jewish-Arab-British parliament with some authority over the internal affairs of Palestine. When the plan to establish a Legislative Council first came up in 1922, its makeup was 2 Jewish representatives, 10 Arab representatives, and 11 British officials. The Yishuv leaders, and especially the labor Zionists, vehemently opposed the establishment of the Legislative Council for fear that it would limit Jewish autonomy. Only heavy pressure from Herbert Samuel, the first High Commissioner, convinced the Yishuv leadership not to boycott the 1923 elections to the Council. Luckily for the Yishuv, the Arab community did boycott the elections out of a refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of the mandate. The Legislative Council was never established, although the British had attempted to revive the idea several times until 1936. The 1923 elections were the first and only time in which the Zionist leadership would agree to the establishment of a legislative body with a Jewish minority. And yet Zionist federative and autonomous plans appeared even before the 1923 elections. In 1918, none other than Jabotinsky proposed the establishment of a federation of national autonomies in Palestine. A year after the 1923 election scare, Shlomo Kaplansky, a labor Zionist intellectual, proposed the creation of a bicameral Palestinian parliament. The upper house would be based on complete parity between Jews and Arabs, while the lower house would be elected in proportional elections. Kaplansky's plan was attacked by his socialist comrades who refused to share political power with the Effendis who exploited the poor Falahim. Instead, Ben-Gurion offered a political system that was plucked almost wholesale from the political thought of the Austro-Marxists. The Austro-Marxists attempted to solve the minority question in the late Habsburg Empire by creating territorial autonomies for each minority in their ancestral homeland and giving personal autonomy, a set of political and cultural rights to each member of the minority that did not live in the territorial minority, in the territorial autonomy, sorry. This was exactly what Ben-Gurion had in mind for Palestine. He envisioned each and every settlement that had a Jewish majority as a tiny Jewish autonomy. By connecting those settlements together, he argued, a broader Jewish territorial autonomy would be created. In addition, Ben-Gurion suggested that those Jews who lived in mixed cities would enjoy personal autonomy. In 1926, Ben-Gurion expanded his autonomy plan by suggesting that the Arabs too would enjoy both territorial and personal autonomy. It's important to note that at this point, Ben-Gurion's plan had nothing to say about the central administration of the country, which he assumed would continue to remain in British hands. This was exactly what mutual non-domination meant. The Arabs and the Jews would control their internal affairs but would not be able to interfere in each other's business. Things drastically changed after the 1929 riots. After the riots, the Zionist leaders had to rethink the Jewish position in Palestine. Ben-Gurion reacted to the riots in a way that might seem counterintuitive. Instead of calling for further separation from the Arabs, he presented a plan for the creation of an independent federation in Palestine. According to Ben-Gurion's plan, the country would be divided into Jewish and Arab cantons, and Jewish immigration would continue unabated to the Jewish parts of the country. As long as there was an Arab majority in all of Palestine, the British would continue to rule the country. Once a Jewish majority had been achieved, Palestine would become an independent federation of cantons controlled by a bicameral parliament, a Senate that would be based on parity between Jews and Arabs, and a lower house, the makeup of which would be determined by the demographic size of each canton. In other words, in 1929, Ben-Gurion envisioned a state that was controlled by a Jewish majority, but was nevertheless not a nation state, but rather a federation of autonomies. The newly founded Mapai rejected Ben-Gurion's plan, still refusing to cooperate with the Palestinian Arab leadership. By late 1931, however, both Mapai and the Zionist Congress had adopted the principle of mutual non-domination as an official policy. The reason for this change was the return of the Legislative Council initiative. It was now part of a British attempt to placate the Palestinian Arabs. In the name of mutual non-domination, the Zionist leadership demanded complete parity in the Legislative Council. Ben-Gurion argued that because there were 15 million Jews worldwide and only a few 100,000 Palestinian Arabs, by offering parity, the Jews were actually giving up their majority status and doing the Arabs a favor. Needless to say, the British did not buy this argument. But the Zionist rejection of the Legislative Council was enough to defer its establishment again and again until the initiative was finally buried in 1936, a month before the eruption of the Arab Revolt. The early and mid-1930s were a fateful time in the Middle East and in Europe. New fascist and rabidly anti-Semitic regimes emerged across Europe, and in the Middle East, Iraq and Syria had begun to move towards independence. All of this signaled to Chaim Arlozorov, who in 1932 was the head of the Jewish Agency's political department, the time was not on the Zionist movement side. In June 1932, he wrote an infamous letter to his mentor Weizmann, in which he seriously considered mounting a military coup against the British and establishing a Jewish military dictatorship until a Jewish majority had been achieved. For the purpose of this talk, I am more interested in Arlozorov's political analysis than in his sensationalist conclusion. He began by defining the Zionist modus operandi as gradual and evolutionary, built on incremental immigration and land purchases. Arlozorov then noted the high Arab birth rate and argued that as time passed by, it would be harder and harder to create a Jewish majority. He added that other mandates in the Middle East were drawing closer to independence and that this would only increase tensions in Palestine. Perhaps more importantly, Arlozorov predicted that within 10 years, a new world war would break out between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union, a war that would destroy the League of Nations, cut off the issue from its demographic and economic support system in Europe, and force the British into an alliance with the Arab world. And except for the part with the Soviet Union, he was pretty much right. He predicted in 1932 what would happen in 1939. In other words, Arlozorov was convinced that the Zionist movement had no more than 10 years to achieve its objectives in Palestine. Because he did not believe that the British would allow for the creation of a Jewish majority within 10 years, Arlozorov suggested to Weizmann that the Zionist movement should switch from evolutionary to revolutionary politics. Hence, his support for a military coup against the British. Arlozorov was assassinated in 1933, and by that time, the Fifth Aliyah was in full swing. For about 3 years, it seemed like a Jewish majority was just around the corner. Indeed, around 1934, Ben-Gurion told the British that he opposed even a legislative council based on parity because the Jewish majority was achievable within a few years. But by 1935, it became clear that despite the Fifth Aliyah, the British were not going to allow the creation of a Jewish majority. When Ben-Gurion examined the international situation in early 1936, his analysis was very similar to the one that Arlozov had offered 4 years earlier. Ben-Gurion noted how the Ethiopian-Italian War, which broke out in October 1935, eroded British hegemony in the Mediterranean, and how riots in Egypt and Syria brought those countries closer to independence. Ben-Gurion was also aware that Britain was courting Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Yemen in an attempt to shore up its alliances. Britain needed the support of the Arab world in the very likely case of a war with Germany. This was exactly why the British chose to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine at a time when German and Polish Jews were desperately trying to find a way out of Europe. When the Arab Revolt broke out in April 1936, Ben-Gurion understood it not as a war on the Yishuv, but as a war on the right of diaspora Jews to immigrate to Palestine. In other words, it wasn't just a colonial revolt, it wasn't just a war against the Jews, it was a war on immigration. It was around this time, I would argue, that Ben-Gurion began to shift from federative and autonomous models to the nation-state model. The main impetus, again, was the need to allow European Jews to enter Palestine. Ben-Gurion, like Arlozov, realized that only a Jewish government would open the gates of Palestine to mass Jewish immigration. Ben-Gurion, like Arlozov, was looking for a revolution. Ben-Gurion found his revolution in the 1937 partition proposal. When the Royal Commission came to Palestine, Ben-Gurion toed the party line and told the Commission about mutual non-domination and how the Zionists did not want to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. But by early 1937, he offered a partition plan of his own. This was even before the Royal Commission offered their own partition plan. Ben-Gurion was not a fan of losing half of Palestine, especially Jerusalem, but he realized that the Jewish state was the only chance the Zionists had of creating a Jewish majority. Therein lies the revolutionary aspect of partition. The Zionists had always assumed that the creation of a Jewish majority would legitimize Jewish self-rule. But the world went topsy-turvy in the mid-1930s, and now the Zionists needed a Jewish state in order to create a Jewish majority. When we look at the Zionist debate around the 1937 partition proposal, it's clear that the main bone of contention was whether such a tiny state could actually absorb millions of immigrants. Although today the 1937 proposal is mostly remembered as a territorial compromise, the exact borders of the state mattered mostly because they determined how much land was available for the immigrants. The partition proposal had forced a revolution in Zionist political thinking. First and foremost, by tentatively agreeing to partition, the Zionist movement jettisoned the principle of mutual non-domination. The creation of a Jewish nation-state would mean that the Jews agreed to dominate others. For the first time in its history, the Zionist leadership had to seriously consider how it would rule over a sizable Arab minority, at least 48% of the state's population. Then there was the question of the new state's regime. A parliament in which half of the representatives were Arab might not allow for mass Jewish immigration. It is exactly at this point that the question of transfer and democracy become conjoined in Zionist political thought. Population removal has been part of Zionist ideology and practice since the first Aliyah. Until 1936, transfer was mostly seen as a way to free land for Jewish settlement. After the outbreak of the Arab Revolt in April 1936, however, we start to see prominent Zionists expressing fantasies of ethnic cleansing. This is probably an effect of the violence of the Arab Revolt and the express wish of the Polish and German government to get rid of their own Jews. At any rate, given the fact that there was barely a Jewish majority in the area allotted to the Jewish state, transfer became one of two ways to ensure that the Jews actually controlled the Jewish state. The other way was to enact a transition period between the official end of the mandate and the establishment of the Jewish state. During the transition period, at least 100,000 Jews would immigrate to Palestine and create a Jewish majority. This is what Ben-Gurion suggested to the Woodhead Commission, who arrived in Palestine in 1938 to assess the feasibility of partition. Ben-Gurion suggested that for a year or two, Britain would continue to oversee the defense and foreign relations of the Jewish state, but would delegate control of immigration and internal affairs to the Jewish agency. The commission members balked at what they described as a Jewish autocratic regime, but Ben-Gurion was unfazed by the term. The Jewish state would begin, he told the commission, only when a Jewish state was in existence. In other words, as long as there wasn't a Jewish majority in the area of the Jewish state, it would be ruled by a non-democratic Jewish government. Then, when a Jewish majority had been achieved, a Jewish state would be born as a sovereign parliamentary democracy. At the same time, Ben-Gurion reassured the British that once Jewish democracy has been established, the Arab minority would enjoy full equality. For Ben-Gurion, equal rights and transfer were not mutually exclusive. Indeed, transfer and/or mass Jewish immigration were seen as precondition to granting the Arab minority equal rights. In the same vein, it was clear that the Jewish state was going to be a parliamentary democracy, but only if there was a Jewish majority. As fate would have it, by late 1938 it was clear that Britain and Germany were headed for war, and the partition plan was scrapped. It was replaced by the 1939 White Paper, which severely restricted immigration to Palestine. The outbreak of the Second World War put political developments in Palestine on hold. Nevertheless, the Zionist leadership was preparing for the day after the war. As Gil Rubin has shown, the Zionist leadership assumed that millions of Jewish refugees would survive the war and must be allowed in Palestine. This assumption has led to the Zionist demand for all of Palestine in the 1942 Biltmore program. Even news of a Nazi genocidal campaign did not change the assumption that those Jews who will survive the war will have to go to Palestine. Thus, the Planning Committee, a major Zionist economic forum that was active between 1942 and 1946, was tasked by Ben-Gurion with devising a plan to bring 1 million Jews to Palestine within a few years. Ben-Gurion was utterly impressed by the technological and logistical innovations ushered by the war. He was convinced that a fleet of ships could move a few 100,000 Jews to Palestine within a matter of months, thereby completely changing the demographic makeup of the country. Once partition was no longer an option, Ben-Gurion returned to the idea of a quick demographic revolution. For Ben-Gurion and his gaggle of planners, the Second World War was a dark cloud with a few silver linings. But some Zionist activists were stunned by the implication of the Nazi genocide for the future of Palestine. Roberto Bacchi, the father of Israeli statistics, realized that the destruction of European Jewry meant that the demographic reservoir of the Zionist movement was now gone. After studying the demography of Palestine for years, he concluded that the birth rate of Palestinian Muslims was the highest in the world. Palestinian Jews, on the other hand, had less than 3 kids on average. This was a new political and demographic twist. In the mutual non-domination era, the Zionist leadership was aware of, but not particularly concerned with, the Arab birth rate. It was assumed that Jewish immigration would eventually trump Arab demographics. The Second World War pretty much stopped legal immigration to Palestine, and the Holocaust meant that there might not be any Jews left to immigrate to Palestine after the war. Bacchi and a group of social workers, physicians, and social planners embarked on a quixotic campaign to increase the Jewish birth rate in Palestine. They collaborated with rabbis to fight abortions, suggested creating an entire welfare system for young parents, and even staged mock trials that shamed single-child families. At no other point in the mandate years were Zionist politics so blatantly gendered, because the onus of having children, and especially of not having enough children, fell on Jewish women. Moreover, it is exactly at this point that the Ashkenazi elite began noticing Mizrahi Jews, both as candidates for immigration and as the only subsection of the Yeshuv that had more than 3 children on average. Baki's work on the Jewish birth rate was a major moment in inter-Jewish ethnic relations, as he attempted to define the differences between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews in social scientific ways. The number of children, age at marriage, age at first pregnancy, number of years of being sexually active, and so on and so forth. In the 1940s, Mizrahi Jews emerged as both the answer to the Yeshuv's demographic woes and as a social problem in their own right. The Yeshuv demographers tried to devise ways to civilize Mizrahi Jews without decreasing their birth rate. At any rate, the Yeshuv leadership refused to invest money in Baki's plan and was focused instead on convincing the Americans to support mass Ashkenazi immigration to Palestine. At the same time, Zionist politicians kept supporting a voluntary transfer of Arabs from the country. As we have seen in 1938, Ben-Gurion insisted that the Jewish state would become truly independent only after a substantial Jewish majority had been achieved. His stance on the matter did not change in the next decade. In early December 1947, a few days after the UN resolution, he calculated that there were about 520,000 Jews and 350,000 Arabs in the area allocated to the Jewish state. In Ben-Gurion's opinion, this was not a stable foundation for the future state. He was worried that the Arab representatives would collaborate with the communists to create a majority in the Jewish parliament. This unstable situation led Ben-Gurion to differentiate between the formal establishment of the state and the actual establishment of the state, which would happen only after the immigration of another 1.5 million Jews. Ben-Gurion believed that this foundational phase would take about 10 years. In other words, he thought that it would take another decade for the state of Israel to be actually sovereign. Even in late 1947, when the establishment of a Jewish state had all but been guaranteed, Ben-Gurion still understood Jewish sovereignty in demographic terms. The flight and expulsion of about 700,000 Palestinian Arabs from the area under Israeli control solved the Zionist demographic/democratic problem. When the State of Israel was established in May 1948, there was already a Jewish majority in place, and the state was born as a parliamentary democracy. Ben-Gurion felt such largesse toward the Arab residents of Israel that he declared in June 1948 that an Arab can be the president of Israel. Not a prime minister, mind you, but still a president. Yet 3 months later, in September, Ben-Gurion demanded the ethnic cleansing of Arabs from the Galilee. How could these two seemingly contradictory statements exist together? I would argue that these statements are not in fact contradictory. Once the demographic threat posed by the Arab population was minimized, Ben-Gurion was willing to allow an Arab to hold a perfectly ceremonial position of president. In that sense, Zionist thinking did not change much between 1938 and 1948. In the Zionist leader's mind, the rights of the Arab population would be determined by its demographic size. To conclude in this talk, I've argued that the demographic question in Palestine has shaped the Zionist political imagination since at least 1917. Between 1917 and the mid-1930s, the Zionist leadership sought political solutions that would mask or at least offset the Jews' minority status in Palestine. With the slow collapse of the League of Nations in Europe and in the Middle East, the need to allow millions of Jews to immigrate to Palestine became paramount. Ben-Gurion then began supporting the nation-state model as a way to control immigration. Since the state would have to be established without a Jewish majority, transfer became an acceptable way to create one. To maintain Jewish democracy, Zionist politicians agreed that the rights of the Arab minority would be determined by its size. This balancing act between democracy and demography would characterize Israeli politics ever since. It can explain the decision not to annex the occupied territories in 1967 and the decision to withdraw from the Gaza Strip in 2005. autonomist ideas did not completely disappear from the political lexicon, but they are now restricted to Palestinian self-rule. In fact, one might argue that the so-called two-state solution is a misnomer. What it actually means is a Jewish nation-state and some sort of Palestinian autonomy. We are now also seeing a push from the right to annex the West Bank without granting the Palestinians the right to vote. In other words, the students of Israel have been too focused on the Jewish part of the term Jewish state and not enough on the state part. What we need is a better account of the meaning of Jewish sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you. My paper today will concentrate in some aspects of the history of the emergency committee, Va'adat HaMatzav, based on a larger scale study which I am concluding these days. And I would like to thank Professor Ron Zweig for enabling me to conduct this study here at the Taub Center. The emergency committee was established in October 1937 in Jerusalem by the Jewish Agency and the National Council, Avad HaLeumi, of the Jewish Yishuv, the pre-state Jewish community in Palestine, under the British mandate. The reasons for the formation of the emergency committee were the gradual disintegration of the British mandate government and the necessity to pave the way for the founding of a Jewish state in a part of Palestine on the background of the impending United Nations partition plan that was about to be approved by the vote of the UN General Assembly on November the 28th, 1947. At the time that the emergency committee was established, the partition plan was already under discussion at the UN. Here at this map we can see what were the borders of the majority proposal of UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, for the establishment of an Arab state and a Jewish state in Palestine. Arab in black, Jewish state in dots, and an international zone around Jerusalem. We can also see in this map Jewish towns and cities in black, Arab towns in white, and mixed cities in both. So this was the majority proposal of the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, while the minority proposal was a kind of binational state, which is less relevant for our discussion currently. But what we need to know is that at the time of the establishment of the emergency committee, this is what the committee members saw in front of their eyes. And shortly afterwards, what they came to see was this, a slightly different map, slightly different, not very much different, which actually incorporated into the proposed Arab state also parts of the northern Negev and the southwestern Negev, and also, quite importantly, from the demographic point of view, the largest Arab city in Palestine, the city of Jaffa, that according to the final proposal that was approved by the General Assembly was to be an enclave of the Arab state within the Jewish state. Here you can see it in orange, just south of Tel Aviv. It actually included Jaffa in its municipal borders, more or less, under the mandate. So the task of the emergency committee, beginning on October 1947 and continuing on November and especially December and the first month of 1948, was in fact to enable the establishment of a Jewish state along these borders. And the committee took these borders very seriously, as the members of the committee were quite convinced that the future borders of the Jewish state, what became on May 1948 the State of Israel, would be these borders, which are almost forgotten now. Since, as Avi Picard showed us in his map, in his previous lecture, the final borders of the state, the borders that were actually in act between 1949 and 1967, included only part of the middle orange area here, which became the West Bank of Jordan, and also a small enclave to the southwest of what became the Gaza Strip under Egyptian administration. So, what did the emergency committee do in order to facilitate the establishment of a Jewish state along these borders? They appointed a legal council, subcommittees responsible for economics, finance, public services, social services, law and administration, civil services. One important subcommittee dealt with the remaining Jewish settlements within the projected Arab state, an important subject which also testifies to the seriousness of the emergency committee members while planning the future borders of the state. They took it as a fact that several Jewish settlements, not many, we're talking about a very few settlements in the central area, in the southern area, very few, and also a block of settlements in the northern part of the coastal plain. All in all, only several thousand people who should have remained in the Arab state, in the proposed Arab state, which the members of the emergency committee believed that was about to be established alongside the Jewish state. So they believed that these Jewish people, several thousand Jewish people, would remain in the Arab state, and they tried to plan how the future Jewish state would maintain the relations, the connections with this future Jewish minority in the Arab state. So, who were these people that I'm talking about? Officially, and maybe a little surprisingly, the head of the emergency committee was none other than David Ben-Gurion, the omnipotent leader of the Jewish Yishuv at this time. However, Ben-Gurion usually probably was a little bit too busy at the time in leading the Yishuv and also leading the military campaign, which I'm going to mention in a short while. Okay, so this man here was, in fact, the leading figure behind the emergency committee. This is Ze'ev Sherf. He was born in Bukovina, Austro-Hungary, now in Romania in 1906, immigrated to Palestine in 1925. He was a socialist Zionist, a secretary of the Jewish Agency's political department at the time, before his appointment to be the secretary of the emergency committee, and later the first secretary of the government, and in the 1960s and early 1970s, a government minister. שרפ's autobiographical book, 3 ימים, מנהל הממשלה במדינה העברית, 3 days, the government administration of the Jewish state, that was published in 1959, was for years the main source for the history of the emergency committee, ועדת המצב. Before the declassification of its files, mainly in the Israeli state archives and also in the Ben-Gurion archives and other archives. But who were actually other prominent and even better known members of the emergency committee? One of them, for example, was Moshe Shapira, later to become Chaim Moshe Shapira, who was born in 1902 and passed away in 1970. He was the leader of the Davish stream in religious Zionism, and at the time, head of the Department of Immigration, Aliyah, in the Jewish Agency. Later on, the Minister of Immigration and Health in the interim government, only to become later Minister of Interior, and so forth. Another prominent member was Eliezer Kaplan, head of the Financial Department of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, and later the first finance minister. And so on and on, other members who became later on partly members of the Israeli government and took active part in the discussions of the emergency committee. So the committee's secretariat, with the help of Jewish members of the civil service, collected detailed information. They collected the information about the British Mandate government that ruled Palestine from 1920 to 1948. And they made specific plans for the transit of power, with the forthcoming British evacuation that actually took part in the very days, in the very time, the very same time that the emergency committee actually was meeting and discussing. And on early February 1948, the committee had to move from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. Why did they have to move? They have to move because of the deteriorating security conditions on the road between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv that made the travel between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, starting from January 1948 and escalating in February, and until March, the travel between Jewish Tel Aviv and Jewish Jerusalem became almost impossible. So the emergency committee had to move to Tel Aviv in order to be closer to the Jewish center of power, where the main Jewish leaders, including Ben-Gurion himself, were based. So what were actually the consequences of this security, of this dire state of security crisis on the work of the emergency committee? Quite surprising, while some of the discussions indeed tended to deal with issues such as mass recruitment and so forth, other discussions kept going on as if there was no war in the country. How come? I will tell you my opinion about this later on, and it is a little bit different than Nimrod's opinion. We are talking about here a situation of an evolving intercommunal war, sometimes called by historians the Civil War, that erupted between late November 1947 and May 1948, the end of the British Mandate and the establishment of the State of Israel on May 14, 1948. It should be noted, though, I have to restrict myself and say that most of the work of the emergency committee was concluded before the implementation of the military program known as Plan D, Tochnit Dalet, starting on early April 1948. A plan that was actually composed by military personnel headed by Yigael Yadin, the acting chief of staff, starting actually on early March 1948. So at the time that the emergency committee members did their work, they were unaware of the military Plan D, Tochnit Dalet, regardless of what I said before, that they were mostly civilian echelon and not military echelon, with the exception of David Ben-Gurion, who was kind of a connecting link between them and the military, but, as I said, usually did not take a too active part in the work of the emergency committee. He probably was more engaged in the military affairs. So, as a way to begin, one of what the committee did, one of its first stages, first acts was actually to commission from the Jewish Agency a comprehensive information gathering process looking at the political situation and living conditions, not only within Jewish communities, but also within Arab communities in the areas designated for the Jewish state. And here I am coming to the elephant in the room. As most of us probably know, the number of Arab citizens remaining eventually within the borders of the state of Israel in late 1949, following the armistice agreement between Israel and the Arab states. The number was 156,000. However, the vast majority of these people who were granted rights of voting for the Constitutional Assembly that became the first Knesset in 1949 and later on became Israeli citizens, the vast majority of this Palestinian Arab population was not living in the areas designated to the Jewish state according to this map here. But they were living in areas designated to the Arab state, such as Galilee, or the triangle, here on the western edge of the central orange area, northwestern part, and in the proposed areas of the Jewish state, one has to acknowledge the remaining Arab population were very few. I would estimate the number in around perhaps something between, including parts of the Negev, not including Jaffa, because Jaffa was supposed to be a part of the Arab state, but including Haifa, and some villages perhaps in Lower Galilee, Jezreel Valley, between 10,000 and 20,000 at most, maybe even less. I think the 10,000 would be, the lower estimate would be more accurate. But how many Arabs did live here before? This is an interesting question. So Israeli historians, such as Benny Morris, put the estimate at no less than 450,000 people, which is only slightly less than the number of Jewish population within these borders. A very significant number. While, as many of you probably know, the number of the Jewish population in the Yishuv on the eve of 1948 was about 600,000, only about 500,000 were included within the borders of the proposed Jewish state, the designated Jewish state. Why is that? The rest, 100,000 Jews, were living in Jerusalem that was excluded, was designated by the UN as a corpus separatum, a separated area under international administration. So according to Benny Morris, the number of Arab citizens, or Palestinian Arabs who should have been citizens in the Jewish state on the eve, or just immediately after the partition resolution, was almost identical to the number of Jews. However, according to the opinion of David Ben-Gurion, it wasn't exactly the same. He estimated in various statements made at the time that the number of the Arab population was just 350,000, roughly. Now, part of the estimation that the Jewish Agency concluded based on British data that was very, very accurate, they went on and concluded, they went on to estimate the entire number of the Arabs and each locality, village, town, and city within the borders of the designated Jewish state, including Bedouin tribes in the Negev, and they were so accurate that they even lowered the number from the initial majority proposal that included Jaffa and also other parts of the Negev. They lowered the figure from about 420,000 to 360,000 exactly. So, the total number of the population within the designated Jewish state, 861,000 people. Out of them, Jews, 500,000. Arabs, including Muslims, Christians, and probably mainly Druze, maybe also Baha'is, 360,000. Now, if we combine that with the number of the population in the designated Arab state, which was roughly identical, and we add to this 1.7 million, roughly 200,000 population, Jewish and Arab population within the Jerusalem, Bethlehem enclave, we just reach 1.9 million, which was the general estimation for the population of Palestine in late 1947 or the years 1946, 1947. You can see here also that according to the Jewish Agency, they estimated that the number of Jews was underestimated by 40 to 50,000 people, probably due to illegal immigration that the British did not include. However, for our estimate, currently, for our estimation, what is important is the number of Arabs. Now, clearly, a very large minority that we see here, a minority of more than 1/3, almost 40% of the future population of the Jewish state. So, as Nimrod already related to and mentioned, according to the vision of the Zionist movement including the late 1940s and even after the Second World War, Jews were supposed to become quickly a vast majority in this new founded state, in what became the state of Israel, due to mass immigration. I saw, for example, one estimation that there would be mass immigration of about 500,000 Jews in a short time, which, as Avi showed us, actually proved itself to underestimate the number of Jews that came in the mass immigration. Still, we are talking about a state, on one hand, with a very large Arab minority, and the question would be, what were actually the intentions of the Jewish state on the way? How to behave towards such a large Arab minority? So, I will not tackle here the issue of the well-known debate about Plan D. What were actually the intentions of Plan D regarding the Arabs who were living within the proposed and also outside of the borders of the proposed Jewish state. I will not enter here this problem, but I will refer to the way that the emergency committee that, as I mentioned, was composed of civilians treated this question. Now, and this is, I have to say, even quite amazing that even in the time of the eruption of civil war, the members of the emergency committee actually tried to do their best to plan the future of the Arab minority in its entirety. Nobody at this time, we're talking about the first months of 1948, when the Palestinian Arab exodus was only in its initial stages, and at the time, no one probably anticipated at the time, we are talking about a reality that looked to both Arabs and Jews in Palestine similar to what happened in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, we saw a phenomenon of Palestinian Arab, mainly elite, people who could afford it, who temporarily left the country to Lebanon, to Egypt, and then when the situation got stable, they returned back again to their homes. And I think that this was actually what most of the people, both Arabs and Jews, anticipated at this time. So the members of the emergency committee were busy in planning Arab education, for example. They had several approaches. One approach said that the Arab education system that lacked funds and was less developed than the Jewish education, than the Jewish autonomous education system under the mandate, could be left the same as it was under the British. Another approach was that the newly established Jewish state would have to improve the state of Arab education. And the third most radical approach, we might say, was that the Jewish state would have to bring Arabs and Jews to full equality. There were actually debates about it, internal debates. Now, in the state of health also, here we see what Moshe Shapira, that I mentioned before, said before. He says, the question of equal level for both parts of the population should appear in every matter. It is a political matter of the first grade. We cannot here and now decide on the line of policy, and the government will have to discuss and decide that. But there is no doubt that in making a separation, there is that making separation is wrong. However, for a certain while, it would have to be left as it is now, according to what was under the British mandate. Under the British mandate, while the Jewish Yishuv had its own autonomous institutions, the Arabs were more relying on the British mandate government in areas such as health and education, and therefore the situation of Arab health and Arab education was significantly less good than that of Jewish. What else? Okay. What else do we have here? Here we have discussions regarding the situation of health. How to organize the health services for the Arab population. In Haifa, in Tel Aviv, for the population of Jaffa, in Safed, and in other places, and what to do not only in urban areas, but also in rural areas that would be included within the Jewish state. So there was a debate whether Kupat Cholim, the main Jewish Histadrut provider of health, should take upon itself to provide healthcare for the Arab population, or maybe there should be another solution. So all these brings us all together, and since I have to conclude now, to the Declaration of Independence, since some of the people who took part on the former discussions were actually signatories of the Declaration of Independence, and also one of the main supporters of equal rights for Arabs was Zvi Berenzon, the legal advisor of the Histadrut, who was quite influential in writing the part of the Israeli Declaration of Independence from 14 May 1948, which states that, and this is a formal translation, we appeal in the very midst of the onslaught launched against us for months to the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve peace, and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its provisional and permanent institutions. So I know that actually there is a huge gap, as I said before, between this and what was implemented on the ground. But I think that the approach of at least some, if not most, of the members of the emergency committee to the future question of the Arab citizens, which at the time they believed that the number would be much, much higher, I think that we might try to find here the roots of what we might say the democratic approach or stream in Israeli politics. Thank you.
Thank you for all of the speakers for this fascinating and evocative 3 papers. We'll now open this up for discussion, questions.
One strand that I see maybe in common amongst all the speakers is, yes, there's a focus on equal rights, but what does equal rights for the Palestinian citizens of Israel mean? It seems that it's individual rights. It's not group cultural rights. That aura kind of seems left for Jewish citizens of Israel, the right to a flag that represents their nation state, or a language, or institutions. So it's individual rights. Sure, you can get health care. Sure, you're not going to be, born destitute, although there's issues there. But so it's about group cultural rights, which Palestinians. Was there any focus on that? How were these thinkers looking at that question? Obviously, we can look back now and see what's happened, but how was that issue focused? Is that how they understood equal rights in a very individualistic setting, or was it a group group idea?
Well, indeed, the emergency committee stressed more issues of organizational level, such as providing education services. Education services should have provided in Arabic. The idea was to provide an Arabic system of education. Health services also, there were disputes whether these should be combined together or left as partly Arab, partly Jewish. Now, regarding questions such as language rights should have been preserved. One of the questions that also preoccupied the committee was how to establish official press in Arabic. Technically, indeed, what we see here, the approach towards the future, the Arab minority that should have remained within the borders of the designated state wasn't ideal. In some ways, it resembles. It is better than what actually happened following 1948, because there was no military regime and other restrictions, but it is not ideal, yet it still tends to relate to the Arabs as citizens with full equality, even though the question of national minority rights, symbols such as flag, national day, so forth, were not discussed.
I want to look at this from the local perspective. I don't think that they refer to group rights of the Arabs, because I mentioned at the beginning of what I said, the shift in consciousness. Now we're talking about 2 local communities. One of them felt the majority until 1948. That was the Arab group. So for the Jewish community, it was to become from a minority, very organized minority, to become the rulers of the city. And I think that in the few weeks between April 1947 and May or July 1948, this was the consciousness that existed in the city. And they thought of the Arabs as their fellow citizens to the city. I think that when Shabtai Levi nominated Tahir Karaman, he was not appointed to the port committee, just his friend. They were friends. But he also wanted to state that the Arab civils of the city are to remain Arab civils as part of the city. I think that changed. I think that we have to make a clear distinction between April, May, June, and July, and so on and so forth. I think that, and there is a clear distinction between those two periods, and I think that there is a clear distinction between local point of view and national point of view. And when we talk about the emergency situation, when they took over localities, they had the national point of view. And here I agree with Itamar, they thought about individual rights.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.